Senator Redondo has. That sounded rough.
Yeah, she had difficulty speaking today. That's just allergies. Drip, drip, drip. So, you know what, I'll dispense with my opening remarks. I know you're very sad about all that, and we can just go to your questions. So, Amanda, what's on your mind?
I just want your general analysis. Was this productive? It seemed as if Senate President Cullerton had a more optimistic view than did the Republican leaders. He said,
Sure.
not at all.
Sure. I thought it was a productive meeting. I think it was meaningful. I think it was good that we met. We agreed that we're going to meet again. I'm not sure the exact date for the next meeting, but we did have a good discussion about a lot of these issues. And Senator Cullerton, to his credit, did a very good job of explaining his position on a multitude of the issues that were before us in the meeting today.
Are you the speaker who doesn't speak?
Well, that's an interesting point. In my response there is to say that I learned a long time ago that when you talk, you don't learn. And my purpose today was to listen to learn.
What
That's
did you
my
learn
answer.
today?
That, as I said, we had a very good discussion. Again, Senator Cullerton did a very good job of explaining his position on a variety of issues. And hopefully, the governor and the Republicans were listening to the arguments that Cullerton was advancing before the meeting.
Well, when they came out, the minority party leaders said that they were still in tune with the governor in terms of his agenda items, and that there would be no budget until there was some level of reform along those lines.
That's their position. They're entitled to hold that position and to advocate that position. As you know from my remarks today, I disagree with that. I think that the number one problem facing the government of the state of Illinois is the budget deficit. I don't think that we can simply cut our way out of the budget. The governor filed a cuts-only budget, which was not balanced. It did severe harm to the medical services available to the elderly, to the disabled, to the struggling families, and it did more harm than good. We need a balanced approach. We need cuts like Senate Bill 788, which would reduce spending in the Medicaid program by $400 million, and we need new revenue, like my proposal to impose a surcharge on millionaires for education.
The question is, if they stick to that belief in which they're entitled,
Yeah.
will there be a budget?
Well, I think that would be a good question to address to them.
Well, they said there will be no budget without some.
Yeah, but I'm responding to your questions, right? So they made that statement, they've adopted that position. You know, if you have questions relative to the consequences of the action they've decided to take, that'd be a good question to address to them. I've explained my position on the budget making and how it relates to the deficit budget, the budget deficit problem. I set out in my earlier remarks that it's not just the current budget deficit problem. You have to layer on top of that let me find my notes, the structural deficits which have been carried forward from previous budgets, the unfunded liability in the pension system, the aggregate debt load of the state, and now this announcement by the governor that he's actually going to borrow for operations. That doesn't seem to have become as significant as it should be. It's a very significant event when a government does and acknowledges that it's borrowing for operations.
So what again was productive and meaningful about today's meeting?
I think the fact that we were able to gather in the governor's office, exchange views, everyone was very respectful of everybody else. When we disagreed with respect. And on my part, there was a sincere interest in understanding the depth of what the Republicans are attempting to argue. That's why I chose not to speak, just to listen.
That you're exchanging the same views now that you exchanged in May, so why are we to believe that anything different will come from this process?
I'm just telling you my observation of the meeting today.
Do you think anything different will come of this process?
Well, you always have to be hopeful. You always have to be hopeful. You know, you can't be pessimistic about these things. So I've been through these budget impasses before, and I've learned that when you talk and exchange ideas, why eventually some people may see a path toward a compromise, which is why I'm hopeful.
Did you see a path today?
I saw a path in terms of what I've said already, that people were willing to engage, exchange ideas. I think that was helpful.
What is your response to the governor said that you're calling his ideas extreme or not part of the budget? He disagreed with you there. What's your response to that?
Well, I would reiterate what I said earlier, that to the extent that the governor is advocating non-budget issues, such as changes in workers' compensation, collective bargaining, prevailing wage, where the implementation of those ideas would reduce wages and the standard of living and send injured workers to welfare and to the emergency room, I view that as extreme. And I think a majority of the people in the state view that as extreme. In addition, by taking the budget negotiations to that extreme, you don't help the resolution of the problem. The problem is the budget deficit. The number one problem facing the state of Illinois is the budget deficit.
And the Republicans say that's not true. Look at the trajectory of Illinois, and it's deeper than that. And you may say that you and Democrats have heartfelt beliefs, but they do too. And they're not going to leave that ideology behind.
Well, that's their decision. That's their decision. Now, I've said this previously, and I'll say it again, that in terms of striving for compromise, we have attempted to meet the governor halfway. As an example, in workers' compensation, both the House and the Senate passed workers' compensation bills. Those bills can be further amended. New ideas can be put into the bills. Next, the governor wanted to privatize the operations of the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. We agreed to that. We only asked one small item, which is to put a 3-year sunset in the bill so that after 3 years, we can come back and look at how well they're doing with privatization in the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. What we know is that this experience in other states like Wisconsin has not worked out so well, which would be our reason for wanting to take a look at the program after a few years. The governor talked eloquently today about his desire to freeze property taxes. In the House, we've called that bill, I believe, 15 times. There's usually about 40 Democrats voting for the bill. If a like number of Republicans would vote for the bill, it would be over in the Senate, under consideration in the Senate. You may recall the governor requested that the legislature suspend its anticipated COLA. We did that. In addition, we kept at a reduced level the per diem and the travel allowances. And then at the request of the governor, we passed an appropriation that would provide for the appropriation of the federal funds only in addition to some general revenue fund money from McCormick Place. So these are instances where we've made a strong effort to meet the governor halfway. And so if there's an interest in compromise, here's some instances where we've attempted to compromise with the governor. It may not be completely to his satisfaction, but this is a budget impasse, this is a negotiation, and if you're not functioning in the extreme, if you're trying to function in moderation, you'd recognize that these are good faith efforts to move toward a compromise.
Senator Collerton said is flummoxed that the governor has not called a meeting before now. He says it's his job to call the meeting. Did it ever occur to you he said the governor's new, he's learning, did it ever occur to you to call the governor and say, I have learned over the years that if you sit down and talk, listen.
I've had meetings with the governor, and we've talked about the wisdom of doing further meetings, and we both agreed that it's a good idea. I've met with Governor Rauner, I think, 3 to 4 times before today's meeting, just over the last month or 6 weeks. So it's not that there haven't been meetings, there have been meetings, and Senator Collerton was in one of those meetings.
The term limits and the redistricting, isn't there a framework of something being discussed now that would take effect at some later date?
Term limits and redistricting are Republican campaign issues for November of 2016. They're being advanced by Governor Rauner and the Republicans because they feel that the presence of those issues on the ballot in November of 2016 would advantage them in the election. I don't think that they ought to be advancing political party positions relative to a future campaign as part of a budget impasse and as part of a negotiation to solve the number one problem facing the state of Illinois, which is the budget deficit problem.
Mr. Speaker, were there any conversations about the bill that would free up gas tax and 911 surcharges for municipalities?
Those conversations are ongoing.
Will there be movement this week possibly?
Well, my hope is that there'll be an agreement.
On what, like adding things to it, or what's under negotiation?
The bill.
After passing,
But would it be the bill that is currently being held in the chamber, or would it be another proposal that's tweaked or
Well,
changed?
it'll include items of appropriation.
Mr. Speaker, can I go off topic just briefly? Have the events in Chicago over the past couple of weeks affected your support for Anita Alvarez's reelection?
Charles, I've been pretty occupied with the budget impasse debate here in Springfield. I don't feel I'm in a position to intelligently comment on the events in Chicago, which have been unfolding over a few days, and so I would choose not to get involved in that issue today.
Speaker, you talked about the desire for Republicans to hear what President Cullerton had to say, and your mission was to listen today. Did you hear anything new from the Republicans in this meeting that changes your thinking? Did you enter the meeting, did you leave the meeting thinking the same that you did when you entered?
Well, I thought that Senator Redondo did a good job in her presentation, and I was impressed that she was prepared to deal with the specifics on a lot of these issues. She surely, she demonstrated an interest in working together and compromise. I think that's a good step. Again, everybody in the meeting was very respectful, and they were sharing ideas, so this is good. It's not bad.
regarding
You
HB.
said that you guys talked a lot about workers' compensation in the meeting and reforming that system. Is that something that Democrats can get on board with, that you can get your party to agree to?
Well, I just said a few minutes ago that both chambers have passed workers' compensation bills that would do changes in the workers' compensation system. So we've publicly acknowledged that there are changes that could and should be done in workers' compensation. There could be additional changes put in those bills. The key question is whether you're going to eviscerate the no-fault system. So in today's debate, people forget that once upon a time there was no workers' compensation. Where there'd be an injury at a job site prior to workers' compensation, the lawsuit would be filed in the court system. It'd be filed under the tort law. And there was great exposure for the employers, because under the tort law in the court system, there's no limits on the recovery. When we moved to workers' compensation, it was really a movement that benefited the employers, because it said to the employers, look, if there's going to be an injury on the job site, there'll be a responsibility on you for the recovery, but the statute will provide limitations on the amount of the recovery. So it was a trade-off. It was moving to a new system, but today people lose sight of the fact that there was the elimination of a great deal of exposure for employers when we moved to this system. What Governor Rauner and the Republicans are advocating is a partial repeal of a no-fault system. Now, they say it in different terms. They have a different way of saying it. But the truth is that for the injured worker, they will be at risk of not getting a proper amount of benefits for an injury which in many instances will end their productive capacity. That's why we're concerned.
You and Mr. Bradley, Mr. Hoffman have talked about the issue of the premiums, not after the
Correct.
reforms of 2011, the premiums are not dropped. Has that been addressed to the governor? Has the governor given you any reaction to a study of that, or to trying to attack that problem?
Well, what we know is that since 2011, there's a rating service, and I don't recall the name of the service, but it's a national service. And they study the question of rates to be charged by insurance companies selling workers' compensation insurance. That rating agency has recommended downgrades or declines in the rates charged by the insurance companies. The insurance companies haven't done that. In addition, there was a study released by the Illinois Workers' Compensation Commission, which at the time was under the control of Governor Rauner, and it basically said the same thing. And so in terms of the evidence that's available to us to reach a judgment on whether we should do further changes in workers' compensation, the evidence would say that the changes done in 2011 are working. They're working. And you ought to let them work their way out and see how well they work in terms of bringing down the cost of workers' compensation, but then bringing down the cost of the rates charged by the workers' compensation insurance companies. It's one thing to talk about the cost. The other thing is, well, what about the rates? Because the rates determine what the profits will be for the insurance
And
companies.
that's my question, you
Yeah.
pass legislation that regulated the rates.
Well, we included that in our bill. And you might call it rate regulation. Some people would use different language, and they would simply say that the item that we put into the House bill would have provided that the Department of Insurance would be in a position to reject a proposed rate as excessive, giving the company an opportunity to go back and review the situation and come forward with a different and lower rate. It's a matter of semantics, but that's how the bill read.
Would you expect to have more to say at the next leaders' meeting?
It depends on how much I'm learning. I like to learn, and if I can learn by listening, that's what I like to do. That's why I listen to all of you so much.
Speaker, the primary candidates have now all been filed, and there are a lot of Democrats, more in cases than usual, that will have opponents there. Barbara Flynn Curry, for example. Are there any races that you're particularly really going to go to bat for your members for? And have you made a decision about Ken Duncan and whether you and the party will continue to back him?
We haven't reached any judgment on primary involvement, mainly because we're preoccupied with this number one issue facing the state of Illinois, the budget deficit problem.
How
Regarding
about
H-
you and your three opponents?
Right, how about that, huh?
Did any of them there because of you and your organization? as
Again,
president?
we haven't had a chance to analyze any of these primary elections.
Do you think
Regarding-
it'd be easier to get a budget after the new year? Is that what we're waiting for?
I'm
Be able
prepared to
put
do
less
a,
votes
I'm
on board?
prepared to do a budget today. I did a budget in May. You recall. When the legislature sent a spending plan to the governor in May, we publicly acknowledged that we didn't have the money to pay for it. And we explained to the governor, we're prepared to negotiate with you to find the money to pay for the budget. And by the way, under the Constitution, Mr. Governor, you have the authority to outright veto, do a reduction veto, do a line item veto. Governor Thompson and the prior Republican governors would do that. They would use the reduction veto and the line item veto to fashion the spending plan to their liking. Governor Rauner could have done the same thing. And what that would mean for today is that the bulk of what we're talking about would be in place. And the agencies that would spend the money would be in a position to spend the money.
Regarding HB 4305, it passed 115 votes.
Which bill is that?
The 4305. And why was a hold put on? I mean, this was a bill that seemed supported by everybody. Why put a hold on it and keep it from getting to the Senate and being passed?
That's the bill that's under discussion today. A discussion that involves the governor's office and the leadership offices. And the elements of the Moylan bill would be included in a bill that could be agreed upon either today or tomorrow.
Speaker, to be clear, you said another meeting was agreed upon. Is there a date and you don't recall it, or a date is not yet?
We didn't settle on a date because most of us hadn't brought our schedules with us.
Will you consider the Moylan bill tomorrow? Do you think there'll be?
Well, we're hopeful that the current discussions will give us an appropriation bill that could be called tomorrow.
What effect do you think the public aspect of today's meeting had on proceedings, as far as before the cameras and microphones? Was it good or bad, or
Oh, I think it was fine. I think it was fine.
what did you like about it?
The ability to speak to you, apparently you were watching.
Do you think it moved the meeting forward? Do you think it helped the meeting when you were in private negotiations to have that public?
Oh,
period?
look, I think it was fine. I think it was fine. I don't think you have to spend a lot of time on, was it better or worse, whatever.
Do you think-
It was
Who was it,
fine.
Caesar? I
Do
mean,
you
was
think
this
TV adds
political?
10 pounds to you?
Excuse me?
Does TV add 10 pounds? Do you mind looking at yourself on television?
You know, I don't watch much television, right? So I really don't know.
Was this political theater though? I mean, that whole thing, was that a charade for the cameras, or was there any purpose to it?
Well, I don't think you would say that of me. I mean, I gave some thought to what I wanted to say. Obviously, a lot of what I said today has been said in the past. I abbreviated my remarks because of the 10-minute time limitation. I was able to make my points. There are points that I've been making over the last several months because I firmly believe that the number one problem facing the government of the state of Illinois is the budget deficit. And that's what we ought to be about working on and solving.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, nice to see you.
Will we be in here tomorrow with you?
We'll let you know tomorrow.
Thanks.
Sorry about that.